This is Tim, and this is Deconstructing Comics. Welcome to Deconstructing Comics. This is Tim in Tokyo. During my trip to the U.S. this summer, I did podcast interviews in Minneapolis, Columbus, Ohio, and Portland, Oregon. This month you've heard some of the interviews I did in Portland and also at my first stop in Minneapolis. We're in the home stretch of the hours of audio I recorded on this trip, and it consists of a number of interviews I did at Helioscope, a studio in Portland. It was once known as Periscope Studio, and Natalie Norragat, who was on the show several times years ago, was once a member. Past DCP guests Jeff Parker and Lucy Bellwood are current members, but unfortunately for me, they were both busy being world travelers when I was in Portland. But I met a bunch of other artists, from mainstream guys to indie upstarts, and you'll meet them over the next few weeks. In this episode, we'll hear from Karl Kesel, primarily an inker but also penciler and writer who's worked on a number of major characters over the past 30 years, including Superboy, Daredevil, Harlequin, Fantastic Four, and Captain America. How has the industry changed in 30 years, for good and ill? How is inking therapeutic? That and more from Karl. Then, graphic novelist Dylan Meconis, creator of Bite Me, a Vampire Farce, the multi-volume story Family Man, and the novella Outfoxed, on why foxes are considered tricksters in many cultures, online self-promotion, and how we'll know comics have really arrived. Karl Kesel in a moment. First, just a reminder that you can help this podcast by making your Amazon purchases via deconstructingcomics.com/Amazon and make that your bookmark for future purchases. We'll then get a percentage of what you spend. It costs you nothing extra and helps us cover web hosting and the other costs of presenting this show every week. We really appreciate your support. Okay, so at Helioscope Studio with Karl Kesel. How are you doing?
I'm doing good, Tim.
Yeah. Now, you're doing what, mostly inking these days? Or?
Yeah, it goes back and forth, but I have to say lately for Marvel and DC and stuff I've done inking, yeah.
Okay. Now, I saw you did some writing in the past?
I've done a lot of writing in the past. Yeah.
But
I mean,
recently.
I wrote, recently I did a Battlestar Galactica miniseries for Dynamite.
Okay.
I wrote that. And before that I'd written a X-Files miniseries for IDW. But before that it was early 2000s when I did a lot of consistent writing.
Okay. All right, well, probably a lot of people listening know your work, but just for people who don't know, what are some of the big things that you worked on? I know you've been in the industry for quite a while.
Like 30 years at this point, hard to believe. But I started out as an inker, did Legion of Superheroes, went on to ink John Byrne's Superman, John Byrne Legends, before Superman, History of the DC Universe with George Perez. I inked World's Finest over Steve Rude. And about that time, I started getting writing work. I wrote the Hawk and Dove miniseries with my first wife, Barbara, and went on to write Adventures of Superman right after they killed him. Jerry Ordway stepped away as writer, and I came in as writer with Tom Grummett. That's when I started working with Tom. And we created that version of Superboy, the 1990s version of Superboy at that point. So Tom and I then moved over, wrote Superboy for many years. Wrote Daredevil for Marvel for a little while. Early 2000s, I wrote the first Harlequin monthly series that Terry Dodson drew and his wife Rachel inked. And then after that, I inked Fantastic Four that Mark Waid wrote, that Mike Wieringo drew. Great run. I was really proud to be part of that. And then, there's other little projects here and there. I wrote a miniseries called Captain America Patriot, which I'm very proud of. I thought that came out really well. Mitch Breitweiser was the artist on that. And a little job I'm really proud of was called Captain America, the Forgotten 1940s Comic Strip. And I wrote, penciled, and inked it. It's the only project I've ever done totally on my own, but I love old adventure comic strips.
It's like a newspaper strip?
Yeah. We structured it like a newspaper strip, which would be split in the middle like the old Captain Easy's would be. So in the comic book form, it could be stacked, 3 tiers on a page. Each double-page spread was 3 dailies. Or a double-page spread was a Sunday. And I structured it exactly like a comic strip from the old days.
Wow.
And I love that job, and I'm very proud of how it came out too. You know, it was set in the days before World War II, and I loved it. So, it's a quirky little job that I stumbled into. I suggested it to Tom Brevoort on a whim, and he said, "That's a great idea," and we did it. I wish it was successful to have done more, because I could have done that for a long time.
Yeah. Sounds like fun. What's useful to you about being a member of Helioscope?
Well, I don't get down here very much lately because we have 2 small children. We adopted about 5 years ago a boy and 3 years ago a little girl, and they take up a lot of time.
Yeah.
So I mean, I don't see a lot of movies anymore, and I don't get down here. But I enjoy being surrounded by talented people, and there's lots of very talented people. I enjoy being surrounded by people who know about stuff I don't know about. The way Kickstarter works, the way Patreon works, the way social media works. I mean, quite honestly, I'm old enough that this is all new to me. You know, I still remember very distinctly one time listening to Erica Moen talk to some of our interns about self-promotion, which to me was a very alien concept at the time. The idea, well, I'm going to take time out of my day and spend it on social media and like promote myself. But obviously that's become part of the job now. Mm-hmm. But when Erica was on, as far as I was concerned, was on the cutting edge of that. She was talking about it very much as part of her life when it was no part of my life. Mm-hmm. And that has changed.
Right, yeah, for traditional Marvel and DC people, you didn't need to spend any time.
No, that was Marvel and DC's job, and all you did was complain about how they didn't promote you. That's really what you did. And now more and more of that is in the artist's hands, the creator's hands, which I'm still getting used to, but I understand that that's part of the job now.
Yeah.
So that's that's a huge part of what Helioscope does for me.
Yeah, it sounds really useful. You get to network and learn what everybody else is doing and keep up with. And
quite honestly, we've got a real wide variety of people in Helioscope. So the sort of comics Erica does is not the sort of comics you're going to see at Marvel.
Yeah.
The sort of comics Dylan does, and I think both of them are extremely talented cartoonists. And, then people like Steve Lieber and Ron Vandal, they're all over the map doing a little of everything. I think the mix is really good to be exposed to.
Yeah, for sure. So now, since you've been in the industry since the 80s, what would you say are the best and worst how do I say this? The best and worst ways that the industry has changed in that time?
Best might be hard for me to think of. I think the worst things about the industry is there's no permanency anymore. When I got in, there were people like Herb Trimpe or Jack Kirby or Gene Colan who worked years on a book, many years, 10 years, and that has disappeared. The idea of saying even 6 issues on a book now is a long run, and I think the industry's poorer for that. I look at someone like Eric Larson and really admire that he's done 225 issues of Savage Dragon, and that's his. And I like the idea of something being a life's work, and I think it's a real loss to the industry that we don't have that very often, at least in the mainstream comics. You have to look at Image, you have to look at web comics for people to do that sort of stretch on a title, on a property.
Yeah, the only other one I can think of recently in Marvel and DC is Bendis on Ultimate Spider-Man.
He did do a long run on that, And obviously Bendis wrote over 100 issues of Avengers too, but there was like 4 issues of Avengers a month sometimes,
Yes.
But yeah, that sort of long run is almost non-existent nowadays.
Well, and the series keep getting rebooted too, and I was reading some Marvels that, like, most of them got canceled. It's like, I'm hardly reading any Marvels now because they all got canceled.
Yeah, no, I read. Yeah, I have to admit, most of the stuff I read is mostly Image and independents, like Terry Moore's work and stuff like that. So that I think is the worst thing that's happened in the industry. what is the best thing? The best thing is the rise of computers. I mean, I'm still very much an analog artist. I still draw on paper and ink on paper, but I have to admit, the use of computers for layouts is a godsend. The idea that you can stitch together, I like this figure here, I like that composition here, oh, the head is too small, I make it larger, smaller, and then you do your finished pencils and inks on that. That's a godsend as far as I'm concerned.
Well, and I was thinking too, with the internet now, it's much easier for people to live, anywhere on the planet and send their stuff into the publisher.
No, exactly. It's we live in. I remember when I could live in Portland, Oregon, and work for DC and Marvel because of FedEx, and now FedEx is too slow. The next day, no, Marvel and DC, and even Tom Grummett in Canada, he can have. Something I've done, or I can have something he's done within minutes of him finishing it. That's amazing.
Yeah. What comics did you grow up reading?
Marvel's mostly, and DC's.
Okay.
But I was very much a Marvel boy when I was a kid.
Specific characters?
Well, I loved the Fantastic Four. I did have a habit of deciding I had a favorite book, and then something horrible would happen to the book. My very first favorite book was Silver Surfer, which lasted 18 issues. I actually bought the first issue off the stand. It was one of the very first comics I ever bought. And I loved the Silver Surfer. And 18 issues later, it was canceled. And so I decided that I loved the X-Men, and they got canceled. And then I loved Daredevil, and it got demoted to bi-monthly. And so I've always had this habit of really, I think, gravitating towards a little more quirky or less mainstream ideas and characters.
Yeah, although of course X-Men and Daredevil really peaked later.
They
did really come back strong.
They did come back strong, and X-Men in many ways was still the same book. I mean, the Daredevil was a very different book when it peaked. Frank Miller really took it in a different direction. I have a huge love of Gene Colan Daredevil, and especially the run with Mike Murdock, where it was Matt Murdock and Mike. Matt pretended to be his own twin brother, Mike. It was inspired lunacy. It was so... you couldn't believe what was happening in that book. And I loved that run very, very much.
So now, I guess lately you've been doing a lot of work on Batman 66.
I was inking a lot of Batman 66 over David Hunt's pencils, yeah.
So how was that? I know you're into the show.
Yeah, I enjoy the show quite a bit. So it was a lot of fun to work on the book. And, Jeff Parker was writing or co-writing the two miniseries I inked. And Jeff writes really good, solid stuff, really fun stuff. He understands the characters and understands storytelling really well.
I think he's one of the best writers for matching the tone of the show.
Yeah, I think you're right, too. I think you're right. And, David, I thought, was doing a great job of capturing the likenesses and, in the very least, the essences of the characters, I really enjoyed David's work anyway, so it was a lot of fun to work with him. He's a good friend.
So do you find a lot of people misunderstand what inkers do?
Yeah, probably. I mean, I don't spend a lot of time worrying about it.
But I think some people think it's glorified tracing.
Yeah.
But I understand that you need to be an artist yourself to.
Yeah, and I think.
Go over the pencils.
Yeah, I mean, glorified tracing. Yeah, obviously that's from Chasing Amy, right? Are you a tracer? No, I'm not a tracer. But many people. I think. Obviously the man on the street has no idea what an inker is. I think people who do like comics understand inking better today than they even did 30 years ago. The fan base and stuff like that. I do think the importance of inking has changed over the last 30 years. I think because of computer coloring is much more important to the finished product than inking is. And I say that sadly as an inker, and not a colorist, but I can see where coloring makes the sort of difference in a finished product that inking used to. I used to say that, if you were comparing inking to films, that the inker was kind of the cinematographer. He's not the director, but he's trying to make sure the director's vision gets on the page. Okay. You know what I mean? And I think the colorist has really taken over that job. So I don't know what the inker does anymore. as an analog to movies, I just don't know what it is.
Okay.
So, but I mean, I still really enjoy inking. I still think inking brings a lot, or can detract a lot from what the penciler has done. I've always considered it my job to. It's the Hippocratic Oath: do no harm. First, do no harm, and I always try to capture in the inks what I see in the pencils. And sometimes it's a kind of a Zen experience. Sometimes I've even said, you need to know what the penciler intended to draw, sometimes more than what he actually drew on the page. So and that, it gets very Zen in there. But I still enjoy inking. I enjoy the act of putting ink on the paper. It's very therapeutic to me.
Okay, how is it therapeutic?
There's just something about the way ink lays down on a nice piece of paper and just that really nice line. And even if you start to get a little dry brush look, there's something about it. I just love the look of it and the feel of it. And I think the feel of it is that tactile part of it is very important, because I've never warmed to digital inking. Never warmed to it. So even though there's a lot of pluses, bad line,
It's
delete.
gone.
It's gone. That is a huge plus, believe me.
Yeah.
But the tactile sensation is so totally different for me, and I've never warmed to it.
So what differences do you find among pencilers? Like, do you have to approach each penciler a little differently, or?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, there are certain pencilers that absolutely everything is there, and really you're just casting in stone or casting in ink what they've put in pencil. And then there's other pencilers where there's a huge amount of interpretation involved. I think less today than there used to be. But I remember the first time, and I did not ink a lot of Kurt Swan, but the first time I inked Kurt Swan, I was like, oh my God, these are really loose. There was a lot of room for interpretation, and so it was good to have Murphy Anderson's images in my mind as something to strive for. And I think a few times I only inked Jack Kirby a few times, but I think there's obviously a lot of room for interpretation there. And then you get into someone like Art Adams, and Art's got everything figured out. He really does have everything figured out. Mike Mignola has everything figured out. Someone like Keith Giffen really has everything figured out. So and then it's really just a case of preserving that, and it becomes kind of a fanboy thing where, of course, I like Mignola's work, so I enjoy inking it. I enjoy Keith Giffen's work, so I enjoy inking it. I enjoy being part of that. But then there's people like Steve Rude, and I remember when I saw his pencils, I was thinking, there's stuff here that I have never seen on the printed page. And I started using some dry brush effects on like some of the edge of his shading on arms. And to me, that captured better what was in his pencils. And I had not seen anyone do that before.
Interesting. Do you think that there are like better matchups of inkers and pencilers, like these two would work well together as opposed to a different inker and the same penciler?
Yeah, I think so too. I think definitely there's I mean, it's like people, right? There's good marriages and there's people who don't belong together, and that's definitely the case. I remember when I lived in New York City, and Steve Rude was going to draw the Mr. Miracle special that Mark Evanier wrote, and Richard Bruning, the art director, thought it would be interesting to see what Kevin Nolan's inks looked like on Steve Rude, and they did a sample piece. It was awful. I don't want to say it's awful, but I mean, it was like...
Didn't work.
It just didn't work. The delicacy and linearness of Nolan's inks did not work with the more broad strokiness of especially when Steve Rude was trying to emulate Kirby. It was not a match that worked well. And both of those are amazing artists. You know what I mean?
Interesting. Now, are you originally from this area?
No.
No?
I grew up in upstate New York, in Victor, New York, outside of Rochester, New York.
Okay. How did you end up here?
Well, I moved to New York City to break into the business, and then I got married to Barbara Randall Kesel, and she did not like New York City. She really did not like living there. And she grew up on the West Coast, so she wanted to move to the West Coast, but I liked living in the North, and I had gone to the Cupid School with Ron Randall, who is a native Oregonian, and Ron said, you should move to Portland. And we actually honeymooned in the area, liked it, and moved out here. And I liked it enough that I've stayed here ever since. I thought about moving back to New York City, a city I love. I love New York City. But I stayed here, and I'm certainly glad I did, because I met my current wife, Myrna, who's the most amazing person in the world. And if I'd moved to New York City, I never would have met her. So I think everything has worked out perfectly for me. And Portland is a great place. I mean, I'm an hour from the ocean, an hour from the mountains, an hour from the high desert. There's great hiking. There's a city that has a lot of vitality. It's got a great cartoonist community. You almost can't find a better cartoonist community outside of New York and maybe Los Angeles, or maybe Minneapolis, St. Paul. They've got some
Minneapolis is developing that too.
Yeah.
I found myself. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, so it's got just about everything I could ask for.
Okay. So now you've done some penciling work too, right?
This much.
Bit.
Yeah, I'm not. I'm
Captain America thing.
Yeah, the Captain America thing. I've done little pieces here and there. I did a 6-page Spider-Man story that Bob Gale wrote. But I'm not known for my penciling, and that's partly because I'm really slow at it. It's very easy for me to take layouts and say, oh, this, I should throw blacks here. This figure's a little wonky, and work that way. But the blank page really slows me down. That blank white page. There's too many options, and it's much easier for me to look at something and say, "Oh, I know how I would fix this, or how I would make it better or stronger in my own head, at least." So yeah, very little penciling on my end.
Okay. Oh, when you have penciled and you're making a page, do you compose a whole page, or do you focus more on composing individual panels?
Well, I'll work out the whole page first, yeah. And I only because otherwise I'll do all the fun stuff first. And then I've got days of drudgery ahead of me. And I've learned a long time ago, you finish something, then you move on to the next part so that you can cross that off your list. There's nothing worse than to have saved all of those backgrounds you really don't want to ink. And then have to go in and ink or draw all those backgrounds. That's all the worst. Bricks or, suspension bridges or whatever it might be. No, I'll work a page at a time as much as possible, certainly.
How do you recharge your creative batteries? When you just don't feel like working, what do you do to get yourself going?
Well, I will say this. Inking to me is very physical. I mean, at the end of the day, when I'm inking, my shoulders hurt, and I actually hold my pen, my brush very tightly. I've got a perpetually cracked fingernail because of the pressure I put on it, and that's been cracked for 30 years now.
Wow.
So I mean, there's a real focus and intensity when I'm making a real physicality to it, and so if I go and writing lets me relax physically. At the end of the day, writing, I can't carry on a conversation. My head is jumbled. My head is drained. But physically, I feel great, And so I find that writing recharges me for the art. And the art is when I'm inking, I can listen to music. I can, have a TV show playing in the background, one that I've seen before I can just listen to. So mentally, I'm being recharged when I do the art. And then physically, so one recharges me from the other.
Different parts of the brain.
Yeah. But to get away from it all, I really enjoy cooking.
Oh.
I cook a lot. Less now that we have small children who have very finicky palates. But I really enjoy cooking, and I really enjoy experimenting with new cuisines and foods and stuff like that. So that's my hobby on the side.
Okay. What do you think about the state of the comics industry right now? Where is it headed? It seems like Marvel is not doing very well at the moment. I guess DC is regrouping some from a low point they had a few years ago.
Yeah.
But then there's a lot more going on outside of that now too than I think there was, maybe even 10 years ago.
Yeah. Well, by that, do you mean like the movies and TVs? Or?
Well, there's that, but there are a lot of independent workers, like a lot of the people in Helioscope who are doing their own stuff that's nothing close to Marvel and DC.
Yeah. And I don't know. I mean, I think Marvel and DC's future is as a staging ground for the movies and TV shows. I mean, really, I think that's what they've settled into. Put it that way. It seems to be what they're very happy with. So I think the real exciting things that you see are at Image and some of the creator-owned stuff, web comics and stuff like that. I love Terry Moore's work. I really wish Paul Grist would do more work of his own. I love Paul Grist's work. And I'm happy that he's doing work for some of the Hellboy books right now for Dark Horse. But I do think that's where I find the most interesting things. I like Paper Girls. Have you read the Paper Girls comic? I love that comic. Mm. And, that never would have seen print at Marvel or DC. I can't anyways. So, and I myself am actually trying to move more in that direction, do more creator-owned. I did recently do a Kickstarter for Section Zero, the book that Tom Grummett and I started in 2000 and had to put on hiatus. And considering the Kickstarter was successful, we're going to do it again. And I would like to think that in 5 years, that's how I'll be supporting myself, is doing Kickstarters for creator-owned properties, which we would publish, Gail Simone suggested a business model that I like, which is the Kickstarter funds a collector's edition. So it's a hardcover, it's really nice. Then you go to Dark Horse, you go to IDW, you go to Image, and they put out the mass market trade paperback. So it costs less, it doesn't have all the bells and whistles, but it reaches a wider audience. Because let's face it, my Kickstarter reached 1,000 people. I would like more than 1,000 people to read my work.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if we're ever going to see the day of 1 million readers, but even 10,000 is 10 times more than what I have right now. You know what I'm saying? So I would like to think that's my future, and I think with the rise of Patreon and stuff like that, I think more and more that's the future of comics. Web comics, maybe I dabbled in that, and it didn't work for me, but I know a lot of other people that it does work for. But this is really, that's where the excitement's happening in the industry as far as I'm concerned. I can foresee a future where comics is like jazz music, where it has really strong devotees, but there's very few names that make it big. You know what I mean? Where you do it more out of love, which, believe me, most of us do it out of love. Most of us do it out of love.
Wait a long time to get the big bucks. Doesn't usually happen. I
did have some very good years thanks to the death of Superman, but that was, believe me, the anomaly.
Yeah, well, and the mainstream sales are not like they were in the 90s.
No, not at all. So, no, it's a whole different world. But yeah, I think the exciting stuff is in the independents and the creator-owned stuff. Yeah.
Okay. And did you go to San Diego this year?
No, I haven't been to San Diego since we got kids.
Yeah, kids kind of make it difficult.
At some point, I would love to bring my children to San Diego just to experience it, but that's still a few years away.
Yeah.
And right now, the two kids are a handful, so to get away for even small shows out of town, it's putting a lot on my wife. So, because unfortunately I don't want to say unfortunately, but we are older parents, and so we do not have the family support group that many people have when they're in their 20s and 30s, because a lot of my family's all on the East Coast, but Myrna's family, their kids are all finally off to college, and most of them are going, now to relax, and they're really not in the mood to help take care of small children unless they're grandchildren, So, and Myrna's mother is quite honestly too old to help us out. So, for me to go out of town puts a lot on Myrna. So,
okay.
So I haven't been to San Diego. But the last time I was there, it had grown far beyond a comic convention.
Yeah.
It's more of a Hollywood thing, a mass media thing.
Right. Well, and I heard on another podcast this year in particular, it was, the person on the podcast said that it was close to hell because so many of the booths like Marvel and DC, whoever, were doing presentations at their booths, and then everybody stops to watch it, and then nobody can move.
Yeah.
And then they've got people all along saying, keep moving, keep moving, keep moving. So it sounded like I was glad I wasn't there.
Yeah. No, at some point I'd like to go. I mean, but I still do enjoy, the Emerald City show is a great show.
Mm-hmm.
Rose City show I've always had good experiences there. I'm going to go to a show in Palm Springs in a few weeks. Palm Springs, California, in August. That's the time to go to Palm Springs.
Sure.
So I had a friend who said, what was this guy thinking, scheduling a convention in Palm Springs in August? And I said, he's thinking it's too hot for anyone to go outside. He's thinking everyone will stay in the air-conditioned convention center. That's what he's thinking.
So Portland is called the Rose City?
That's their nickname, the Rose City, because of all the roses. There's a beautiful rose garden on in the West Hills.
I see.
Yeah.
I didn't know that until yesterday. Okay. What's the best advice you've heard for new creators?
That's a stumper. The best advice. I don't know. Dylan will handle that one much better than I would. I guess, just looking at myself, the best advice I could give anyone would be always strive to get better and don't be afraid of something new, like technology, which I'm trying to deal with myself. So that's the best advice I could think of giving. So.
Karl Kesel is on Twitter at Karl Kesel. Coming up, Dylan Meconis tells us how we'll know when comics have arrived, and she has a lot of advice about promoting your comic online. Thanks to our patrons. Last week I released vintage episode number 115 from February 18, 2008, an interview with Chris Staros from Top Shelf Productions. This week I'll be releasing number 114, featuring Mulele and me talking about the state of his comics career at the time, the Spider-Man One More Day event, the Hollywood writers' strike, and more ancient history. Watch for it at the end of your podcast feed, on our Facebook page, or at patreon.com/deconcomics, where you can pledge a monthly amount to keep the show going and unlock more vintage episodes. We appreciate your support.
This is an imaginary podcast, which may never have happened.
The Shortbox Showcase.
But then again may have. About a father and daughter. I'm Professor Allen.
And I'm Emily.
Who came from Ohio and talked about comics.
Walking Dead.
Tintin.
Black Lightning.
White Tiger. It tells of their rise to glory, when the great guests were yet to be booked.
Let's put it this way, Shogun Warriors wasn't going to win any Eisners.
And the great feats of editing not yet performed.
This is Ultra 7, this is Ultraman Jack, and this Ultraman Taro, and this Ultraman Leo, and this
of how they spoke at length.
Continuity is really the brainchild of nitpicking nerds the world over.
But to be fair, the best kind of confession is the Force confession.
And reviewed in brief tales that explore creatively the bounds of a given character's history.
Red Sun is wonderful with a very strange ending.
Of brilliant creators before their fall from grace. This is the era where Miller is at the height of his creative and artistic powers, and the ability of strong writing to encapsulate and transcend its time.
Flash of Two Earths by Gardner Fox.
This is an imaginary podcast. Aren't they all? Shortbox Showcase is part of the Relatively Geeky family of podcasts. Check us out on the web at relativelygeekypodcast.blogspot.com or search in iTunes for Relatively Geeky or Shortbox Showcase. And remember, we're not experts.
We're just family.
Okay, now I'm with Dylan Meconis. How are you doing?
I'm well. How are you?
Pretty good. So you're also working in Helioscope. How long have you been in the studio?
I've been in the studio since around 2007,
Okay.
and full-time since around 2008, 2009.
Okay. How has being in the studio been useful for you?
Oh, it's totally been everything for me. I think I'm somebody who really loves working in an intergenerational atmosphere. Like, I was miserable at college because I didn't like living in Kid City, where everybody was within 4 years of age of me. I was like, I want grown-ups and children and pets around. I'm an only child, so I've always liked grown-ups better. So for me, getting access to other professionals across a spectrum of experience levels was so gratifying, and even at a very young age, my expertise was taken very seriously in the areas where I already really knew what I was doing. But there are also plenty of things I was utterly clueless about, and that fellow studio members were happy to inform me of proper procedure. And just having access to shared resources. Some people are really happy working at home totally alone. I get weird real fast. So just having an environment where I can stand up from work and have a conversation and air out my brain and not feel like trapped in my little work bubble has been really important to me as well, just in terms of making it through long jobs, making it through frustrating situations. It's just a huge support, both emotionally and professionally.
Yeah. Of course, Karl's been in the industry for decades. That must be... Has he given you any tips?
Oh, man. No, I was a funny story. In 5th grade, one of the first superhero comics I read was Death of Superman. And at some point, belatedly, as an adult studio member, I realized that Karl had worked on Death of Superman, and I immediately, shut down in terror. I'm like, oh no.
This guy killed Superman.
No, he knows what he's doing. Oh no. No, I've gotten advice from everybody in the studio, and I mean, I've given advice too. Karl did a Kickstarter really recently, and it was kind of his first big time really putting himself out there online. And that's something I have some pretty decent experience with. So it was really fun for me to be able to give back and sort of help him with some of the planning or suggest some tweaks to make the project extra appealing to an online audience. So there's been a lot of skill share both directions.
Yeah, I know it's tough to promote yourself in a way where you can kind of get out of your own head and figure out what's going to be appealing about it to other people rather than what's appealing about it to you.
Yeah, and also there are just different channels and audiences depending on where you're putting your work. You know, if you're creating a comic to sell in a comic book store on a rack, that's a very different set of considerations from if you're creating an online funding campaign and people are going to be seeing links to it through Twitter and Facebook.
Well, elaborate on that, because I think that would be useful to me, and I'm sure the listeners also. So, anything more you can tell us about that? What's the difference between those two things?
It's huge. I mean, so much of online promotion and distributing your work is self-directed, right? Because generally, if you're working through the direct market or stores, there are a lot of intermediaries who know they're going to benefit from your success.
Sure, Diamond and the retailers.
Yeah, exactly. And they're all... their degree of investment in it is going to be highly variable, but still at the same point, nobody wants you to tank. So you're going to get feedback from, if you're working with a publisher or the marketing department, Diamond's going to tell you, here are listing format requirements. You're going to work with retailers. You have a lot of people who are between you and the audience and have their own requirements and expectations of what's going to make it to that audience. When you're working online, it's a little bit the Wild West. There are things that work better. There are things that work less well, but you can really only find out what works for the kind of people who like your stuff online by doing it yourself, or by looking at people who do work similar to yours and seeing what's succeeded for them and what hasn't. It's really, you have to do all of the legwork and the research. Nobody's going to come to you with a template and say, do this and everything will be fine.
Well, give me an example, like a certain comic that you've tried to promote online. What worked for that?
I know that you read my comic Outfoxed recently, so that's an example. That, ironically, that was a comic that I designed for print, because I had been working almost entirely digitally. I had published some things in print, but the web was always their first place to go. So I had never had print considerations in mind, which led to a lot of fun when I had to put impossible color palettes on paper with ink. But for Outfoxed, I wanted to use really traditional materials. I wanted to learn how to ink with a brush. I wanted to create it to the dimensions that a print comic is normally expected to be in. And then I wanted to have it bound with staples like a floppy comic book and be the same length that people expect a floppy comic book to be. So I started very traditionally, but then I knew if I wanted to sell it in that physical format, I was going to have the most luck if people had read it already digitally. It was going to reach a much wider audience much more quickly if it was available for free online. than if it were, a $10 comic book that's 24 pages long by somebody who's mostly worked online. That's not necessarily going to get a lot of investment from people in the print market, right? It's going to be like, who is this and why does she think this is worth so much? Mm-hmm. Online, I already had an audience, and so putting up a big chunk of free content all at once was a really great way of just getting that story out there. And then a few months later, I ran a Kickstarter campaign to put it into print, along with 2 other projects, one of which was a book of mine that needed a reprinting, that had started out as a webcomic, and I sell a print edition to readers. And the other one of which was just a little series of art prints that I wanted to turn into a little novelty book. So I bundled all 3 of them together, and I launched a campaign where you could order all 3 books or just one, and tried to tie them together with theme, and just went bonkers about it on Twitter, and posted about it on forums, did some podcast interviews with people, and a lot of the people who had read the book online and really liked it then spread the word about the campaign itself. So it was leveraging a lot of different things, and it involved a lot of timing and a lot of spreadsheets. I had help from friends who knew what they were doing, thank goodness. But it was still, it was playing one version of the story off of another version of it, so using the formats to leapfrog each other into different markets.
Okay. Well, elaborate on your Twitter strategy. How do you go about...
Strategy is a very generous word.
Or approach, maybe?
Yeah. The most important thing about having a Twitter presence, or a Facebook presence, honestly, as a comics creator who wants to promote their work online, is to have a really positive attitude, to post work regularly, even if it's just doodles or sketches, but make it clear that you're doing work every day and you're always working on something interesting. Interact with other creators, promote their work when you see it coming out. If there's a Kickstarter of a webcomic that you're a fan of, help them promote it. Because guess what? In 6 months when you do your own campaign, they're going to be much more likely to spread the word to their audience if you've helped them out before. So you have to spend a lot of time building that reciprocity. You can't just suddenly appear on Twitter, start an account 3 days before your funding campaign launches, and then expect everybody to, hit the retweet button.
Right. If nobody's following you, then a Twitter account's not going to help very much.
Yeah. If a Twitter account with no followers tweets in a forest, doesn't even know. Nobody cares. So there's a lot of cred that you have to build up, and it's the same with the print market, right? But sometimes you can borrow other people's cred, whether that's, being a debut author from a really respected publisher that has a very clear sort of brand to their work, like Image. And online, it might be getting retweeted by somebody who has a lot of shared readers with you, or who does work similar to yours and has had really successful funding campaigns. So when they tell their readers, hey, if you liked my thing XYZ, you'll really like Dylan's work ABC, now on Kickstarter. So you can't go in with quite that mercenary transactional of an attitude. You really do have to make friends first. Mm-hmm. But then if you have that built up for yourself, it's something you can really tap into when you need it.
Okay, so when you said go bonkers on Twitter, do you put out something every hour, or do you use Hootsuite or something so that you can time all these tweets? Or
yeah, it's really...
What do you do?
It's a delicate balance because you don't want to exhaust people, right? Yeah. You really have to try to meter it or keep things fresh or interesting, either by saying, hey, I'm adding something new to the campaign, so that's why I'm telling you about it again. Noting that you've reached some point in production or that you're close to a stretch goal. So you try to keep it varied. You try not to exhaust people with too much promotion. Mm-hmm. You also just have to try not to second guess yourself too much. This is your job. Mm-hmm. If people don't want to hear about your project, they can mute you for a while. It's okay. You're not going to alienate anybody unless you're, being a jerk about it, or shaming people for not backing you. Folks understand. They understand that they're following a professional and they're there to support your work or to hear about your work, so they're going to deal with it. I I don't know that I'm a master at it. It still makes me really uncomfortable. I think my studio mate, Lucy Bellwood, is one of the best at it. She manages to maintain this upbeat, high energy, like inclusive, playful voice. So she can go for an entire month-long campaign talking about it, really like every few hours, at least twice a day, and you don't get tired of it because her enthusiasm is so palpable and her updates are, a little bit different every time. It's not just the same message reposted over and over and over and over and over and over and over again.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I read Outfoxed, but how would you describe it to someone who hasn't read it?
It is an original fable or fairy tale, a short story about a young laundry girl walking through the woods on her rounds who encounters a fox who's in a bit of a sticky situation. He's escaping a fox hunt, and things unspool from there. There are some unexpected reversals between this fox and this girl. I do not guarantee a happy ending. I've had some people email me very upset that the ending is not happy. I was like, well, sometimes these things don't work well. But for me, it's a parable about friendship and about prejudice and about what we do with our friends and our loved ones when our position in life changes.
Okay, yeah, I read it a couple of times and I felt like there's a point here, but I'm not sure if I'm getting the right point from it. And I felt like what I was getting was that the fox is trying to get her to love him, and so he's thinking if he changes to something else that she will love him, but it's not working. And maybe there's sort of a be yourself message in there. I'm not sure.
Well, he has a very transactional attitude about it, right? Like he thinks that
he's like, love me.
Yeah, he thinks that achieving this girl's love is going to help him achieve a certain status in the world, right? It's a box to check as opposed to him genuinely being interested in having a real relationship with this person. And at the same time, she has a prejudice that she can't get over, which is that he's not an appropriate choice for her. So they they both approach it from unfortunate angles that they can't quite get over.
Okay.
So people are like, is there a specific moral? I'm like, well, you're allowed to read into it. There isn't a right or a wrong answer, and it's been really fun for me to see people's different interpretations of it. And I think because it takes the form of a fable or a fairy tale, some people really want there to be a super clear, like, single sentence answer to what it means. Like, no, it's a story. You can find what's in there for you and run with it. And I love reading this comic with classrooms. I've read it with late elementary school up through high schoolers, and I generally get student volunteers, and one will be the girl and one will be the fox, and I'll do the incidental voices, and I have a panel-by-panel presentation version of it. So they don't read the whole page all at once. They just read, dialogue balloon by dialogue balloon. So the ending is a surprise for them all. And the reactions are so great because I can see, like, the gears turning in kids' heads because they've been trained on those very straightforward A, B, C, D narratives where thing happens, ending happens, moral. And so they're met with this ambiguous ending, and they'll just start spontaneously having a debate about what it means and about which character was right and which character was wrong. And the teacher and I just sit there and, like, high-five each other silently. It's like, yes, they're engaging with text. Cool. So that's really a blast.
Yeah, sounds like it. And then we were talking in the studio upstairs. You got a panel of that included in this exhibit about Oregon art?
Yeah, the Oregon Historical Society has a museum here in Portland, which is free admission to Multnomah County residents, which is awesome. And they did big core exhibit on the history of comics and cartoonists in Oregon.
Okay, comics specifically.
Yeah, very specifically. It was called Comic City USA. You can look it up on their website and go through some of the materials about the exhibit. It was really fantastic. It was a really thoughtfully composed exhibition. I spoke on a panel of creators who were featured in it. Because Portland and Oregon have a real storied history of working in the comics industry. Obviously, now we have like half a dozen comics publishers here.
Yeah, I know Image and Dark Horse and Oni, and I'm not sure who else.
We have Top Shelf here.
Top Shelf, oh yeah, they moved here, didn't they? Or
they were here originally, and now they've merged with IDW, so they're kind of an IDW satellite.
Okay.
It's really...
They had a location in Georgia or something, too. I don't know if they still do.
But now there are also tons of just small independent publishers who are maybe just one or two people working together. So it's really sort of a comics mecca. I think the only two towns that have a comics scene this big would be New York and LA. And those are such huge entertainment industry towns anyway that it seems a little more organic, whereas here it's very much growing up like a little thicket of mushrooms. So there are hundreds of cartoonists here. Like, I literally don't know everybody who lives in Portland who works in comics. Like, we all cross paths at parties, but there are people who lived here for 5 years and whose work I love who I've never run into in a social context just because there's so many events going on that you can't possibly hit them all.
Yeah. Minneapolis has quite a few creators, too, but they don't really have any publishers, as far as I know.
Yeah, I know Minneapolis College of Art and Design has a great comics program, so I know a lot of people are drawn to the city that way.
I think it's interesting. So, because I live in Japan, and in Japan also, like in going way back, foxes are portrayed as trickster characters. It seems like to be maybe across a number of cultures that kind of foxes have that reputation. What are your thoughts about foxes?
Well, they're scavengers, and I think a lot of scavengers develop the mythological role of tricksters because it means they come really close to human settlements and they steal things from it. So there's inherently this relationship, this gotcha relationship between humans and creatures that avail themselves of our resources without becoming domesticated. So cats have basically domesticated themselves. Obviously dogs, we domesticated. But when you have, here in the Pacific Northwest, it's coyotes, ravens, you have foxes, they all have that trickster role. And I think it's because of that little dance over resources that's created, where clearly there's a relationship, but it's not one on equal footing.
I see. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So, did you grow up in this area in Portland?
I'm from Seattle originally, and I moved down to Portland after college. Actually, I went to college in Connecticut at Wesleyan University, and that was 4 years was enough time outside of the Pacific Northwest. I really love it here, but I also really wanted to carve out my own space, not just stay in my hometown, and I already knew so many comics people here in Portland that it was a pretty easy lift. So yeah, I just wandered down I-5 and settled in. So I've been here since 2005.
I see. Wow. So what other work have you done besides Outfoxed?
Oh, a bunch. My very first professional project was a super silly comic called Bite Me, which is about a pack of very incompetent vampires trying to make it through the French Revolution without being collectively guillotined. It's very Bugs Bunny, super silly, a lot of jokes about beheadings and garlic. And I did that online. It was published through a now sadly defunct publisher called Modern Tales. That was really my first paying gig, and that was also the first book that I self-published. I have an ongoing graphic novel series called Family Man, which is historical fiction, love story, werewolves, theology jokes. And my big current project is for Abrams, New York publisher, and it's a middle grade graphic novel. Also kind of got a bit of a historical fantasy setting. It's about a young girl who grows up on an isolated island convent, raised by the nuns, very idyllic. And when she starts to come of age, she learns that it's actually a political prison for troublesome noblewomen. And when actual royalty shows up on the island, things get even messier. So she has to figure out how to save her home and her friends and her island nation and discover who she herself really is.
Okay.
And that's going to be coming out in 2018, but I'm working on that full time right now.
Wow, okay. When you meet someone new, do you identify yourself as a comics creator? Do you talk about comics right away? Or do you identify yourself as something else? Or how do you introduce yourself?
Oh, like if somebody asks me, what do I do for a living?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll generally say that I make comic books, because the reaction is always really fun. People always go, oh, that's so cool, or neato. Sometimes they look a little scared because they have an idea that graphic novels are cool and that they're supposed to have read them. And the fact that they haven't means they're uncool, and I'm going to think they're... I think a lot of people worry about, like, oh, I'm going to be judged as a nerd for what I do. And I'm like, no, people are worried that they're not cool enough. So I'm always happy to dive in. And I don't look like what people assume a comic book professional does. I'm a tiny female with a punk haircut. I'm not a white dude with a shaved head and a beard wearing a large black t-shirt. So I like flipping people's mental paradigm a little bit. And I don't mind talking about the industry, or it's fun for me because I totally live in the cartoonist world. So getting to sort of, I don't know, correct people's misapprehensions or suggest some titles of books that they or their kids might enjoy. It's fun for me. I like doing outreach.
Preacher, no. But yeah, I think that's really changed over the decades, because there were times in the past when comics creators would have been embarrassed to tell certain other people.
Yeah.
Well, in fact, even like in the 50s, after the Wortham stuff, people would actually get angry if they found out you were a comics creator.
Yeah, absolutely.
Crazy to think about now.
No, now pretty much the worst thing I have to deal with is somebody asking, oh, which ones do you draw? I'm like, well, I don't draw Spider-Man, so I'm not sure what you're expecting to hear. But, nowadays the best-selling cartoonist in the country is my friend Raina Telgemeier, who does comics for middle grade. And, I can just say, oh, I'm going to do a lot of stuff like, if a kid likes Raina Telgemeier's work, they might like my next book, and that's a much easier bridge to cross.
Yeah. I tried to get an interview with her. I just can't get past her publisher people or her agent or whoever.
She's a little bit busy, comprising 5% of all graphic novel sales. That's a burden to bear.
Yeah. Tough to be her. What's the best advice you've heard for new creators? Yeah, Karl thought you'd do better at this one than he did.
Yeah, one of the things I also really enjoy about Helioscope is that we regularly take on young creators as part of our mentorship program. So we will basically have a 3-month residency where generally a college student or a recent graduate will come in and essentially have a free membership for 3 months and receive free mentorship. We'll guide them through projects. They can use all the resources in the studio. So we actually are in a position of giving advice to new creators. I think a lot of the most useful stuff is, honestly, it's pretty dry business advice, because so many kids are already insanely talented and professionally skilled because they're looking at their peers' work on the internet starting at a very young age. So, their drawing skills are all there, their storytelling skills are all there, they're doing stunning work, they're totally technically adept, but they don't know what an invoice should look like, or they don't know how to respond to an email asking how much it would cost for them to do an illustration, or it's stuff that isn't really addressed in art school because...
Right, the business stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. So the advice that I give to a lot of young creators is things like, if you're getting a contract for work that you care about, you should hire an attorney to read it for you. Or you should get somebody to prepare your taxes, because doing your taxes as a freelancer is really difficult and the consequences can be pretty big. All the way down to very basic stuff like, you should have a website. It should just have your work on it. It shouldn't be a Tumblr full of other people's fan art that, you're reblogging for other people to see. Your email address should be your real name. not a screen name or a wacky anime reference. Like, really, you have to have very straightforward ways for people to find and get in touch with you. And then you have to be able to respond professionally to professional inquiries. You can't, shrink up into a tiny little ball and freak out because you're being asked to price your work. And that's hard because so much of our work is so personal and is really done for enjoyment. But if you want it to be your job, you also have to treat it like a commodity, and that can be a real challenge for folks.
Do you think that kind of thing should be included in art school? I've heard some creators say they wish that the school they went to had covered that part of it.
Absolutely. I think it's a huge gap. And I sort of understand why it's a gap. It's not romantic. When you're 18, you're not going to art school so that you can learn about price anchoring and client negotiations. And because so many, for all that there are tons of wonderkins who are already professional level artists by the time they enter college, there are a lot of kids who really do need a ton of technical formation before they get out in the world. But I think there's a huge lack in our education system in general about teaching professional skills like that. And 2 weeks or one guest lecturer is just not enough. Mm-hmm. It's not enough time. It was a lot easier when people would have actual physical portfolios of your work, because you would have a portfolio seminar and you'd work on putting it together, and then you'd go out into the world and show that to art directors. Well, now you have to put your work in a lot more places and curate it very differently and learn how to communicate with other people, where previously you would have just been sitting across a desk from someone handing them a slog of your work.
Right, yeah. Well, when Karl came up, we were talking about, the publisher did that stuff for you, or they were supposed to, and, there was no social media, and, you really couldn't promote yourself very well, and you didn't think about it.
Yeah, you weren't going to take out an ad in the local paper.
No.
And honestly, for me, it's been really, I think entertaining is the best word. So Abrams is one of my first experiences working with a publisher on work that's totally original to me. I'm not just a freelance contributor to it. And it's so bizarre for me to have outside help. Mm. My editor...
Why are you helping me?
Yeah, my editor, Susan Van Meter, was not laughing at is too mean a word, but she was chuckling at my ridiculous amount of drive, where she's like, look, I am absolutely certain that you could do everything in this book. You could design the print edition, you could do the cover, you could do the promotion, but we have people who do that for you. And we really appreciate, all the input you're going to be capable of, and that's going to make a big difference for this book. But it's actually better if you don't do it all.
It takes less time, maybe.
Yeah, well, it's much more efficient
less of your time,
to delegate stuff. And authors are expected to do a lot more than they used to, even when you're working with the publisher. But you're still not doing it completely on your own. And for me, that's the norm. And I think for a lot of cartoonists my age and younger, that is the norm, where we work in a very fragmented industry. And so we've gotten used to doing it for ourselves, totally on our own terms. And the internet has been the best vessel for that.
Yeah, well, I'm sure that goes beyond comics, too. A lot of musicians, I think, are doing things that way, just doing everything by themselves. And probably a lot of other areas that don't come to mind immediately.
Mm-hmm.
And so I got to thinking about that. You said that just in general, maybe education system should talk more about the business side, not just at SCAD or MCAD or someplace, but in general school.
Well, self-employment is becoming more and more a primary means of, making a living in this country. We're going to have more and more and more freelancers as time goes by.
Yeah.
So it's not just purely about your interview skills anymore. You really have to learn how to present yourself and have heaven help us, a brand.
Barf. Yeah. Well, I'm trying to deal with that in podcasting, too. And
it's a very competitive space.
And it's difficult to find time to do much self-promotion because I'm making podcasts and I'm doing my day job.
Absolutely. Well, and some people are better at one side of that than the other.
That's true, too.
And it's really... I know plenty of people who figured out eventually that doing full-time creative work was not sustainable for them. Not necessarily financially, but sometimes just emotionally, because the kind of work required of them was taking too much time away from the actual creating. So for them, it was worth it to just do the creative work for itself and, make whatever money can be made off of it passively and easily, and then rely on less emotionally sensitive work to pay the rent. And I think that's completely honorable. There's a lot of pressure on kids to, achieve your dreams and do this full time. Like, well, not everybody has to. I mean, how many great writers and scientists and artists honestly have had day jobs while writing their masterpieces? It's okay. If this is not your bag, you have other options. You're still allowed to exist as a creator and make great work, even if being your own PR person and agent and editor and bookseller is not work you're cut out to do. You have to recognize your capabilities and also your weaknesses and kind of decide where it falls best for you.
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of other people in my position where they could use help but can't afford to pay anybody to help them. So
yeah, there's a big gap there. And
difficult situation.
Some people are really quick learners and other folks need a really long time to internalize, skill sets that other people make a living off of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So getting back to making comics. So now you, of course, you write and draw. So do you write a script first, or do you sort of write it as you're drawing it? How do you approach that part of it?
It changes with every project. I really like doing totally new stuff every time I start something. That's part of the fun challenge of comics for me, is that there is no regimented process for how you approach it. So for the book I'm currently working on, I had a fully written manuscript before I really went anywhere with it, and formatted down to pages and panels, almost like screenplay style, because I knew I wanted to have it traditionally published. Mm-hmm. So the more material I had that was designed for somebody else to ingest and understand, the better. So I had that, and I had a big pack of sample pages that I sent out. And once that all got approved and the book was sold, I went through and I did empty layouts for every single page. So I drew all the panel borders and put down all of the lettering. And,
okay.
No
art, just
temporary digital lettering. But yeah, I basically just thought through the basic composition without putting down thumbnails or anything, because I knew that if I just was looking at this wall of 380 totally blank pages and this giant brick of a script, I was going to lose my mind, because it would be like every new page would be like scaling a tiny mountain and solving a ton of little problems. So I just powered through the entire thing that way, just putting down panel borders, and then went back, and now I'm penciling my way through the whole book. And it's lovely because each new page I enter into, I have this great blank framework that already suggests pacing and, character positions. I feel free to change it, but instead of looking at that blank page, I have this great suggestion. And that came from working with a publisher, I think it was Learner, who would actually provide me with layouts when I was doing art for a comics project of theirs. And I loved it. It took some of the emotional intimidation factor out of it. But other projects like Family Man, I have a loose script for it, and I compose each page as I go. Sometimes I don't even look at the script because the previous page suggested a different direction, and I do the whole page from blank to colored and lettered in the course of 2 days. So it's totally depends on the project and how I want to go about it. It's fun.
Okay. So do you do all your drawing in computer, or are you using paper and then scanning it? What do you do that?
Yeah, these days my preferred method is to do all of my thumbnailing and penciling digitally. I really love the program Manga Studio, which is now called Clip Studio Paint for reasons nobody can quite.
Clip Studio Paint.
The software is written by a Japanese company and it's distributed by Smith Microsystems in the U.S. So there's a long tail of trademark. It's very boring, but Clip Studio Paint has a really wonderful drawing engine. It's designed for people to draw comics in. So it has a really natural feeling engine for putting down pencils. And if I draw something too big, I can shrink it. I can move things around in a composition, as opposed to doing that with pencil, where I'm actually looking at erasing or redrawing things. So it's a very efficient way to get through the very thought intense and choice intense part of drawing. And then for inking and coloring or lettering, I decide on a case-by-case basis how I want the final product to look, and I'll either ink it, on paper in real life, or if it's like a freelance project and it needs to be done very quickly, but it still needs to be editable, I'll do it all digitally. So I'm almost always starting purely digital, but then I can end with a natural media finished product, or I can end with, a digital file that's ready for the printer. It's fun to have that kind of flexibility and choice. It's been a real game changer for me.
Okay. So kind of all of the above.
Yeah. Yeah, I am not married to any particular process or any means of publishing or a particular drawing style. Kind of being a bit of a shapeshifter has always been my preferred method.
So when you don't feel like working on comics, what do you do to recharge your batteries?
I clean the house.
Oh.
No, seriously, I love it. It's very relaxing. No, I really love cooking because it's a great way of coming down off of the comics process, where I'm still creating something with very focused intention, but at the end I have a meal. I have something very solid and that I can enjoy, and it's ephemeral, and then it's done. It's not like comics where it's this years-long process. You met my dog, Teddy. Yeah. He's a very sweet boy. Love taking him on walks. He has his own agenda, and I appreciate being forced to follow along with it. He will smell everything in a 20-block radius. So
I'll interview him today too. He'll probably sniff the recorder.
Yeah, snuff, and then ask if you have any treats. No, it's great because it gets me outside and I'm on somebody else's time. Because when you're doing comics, you're providing everything and you're making every single choice. So it's nice to be in situations where I might be in charge, but I'm not the one creating the entire framework that lies before me. I can kind of just go with the flow. So anything that's that's that middle ground between creative work and totally zoning out. That's what I really like.
Okay. So where do you think the comics industry is headed?
Boy, part of my trouble answering that question is I don't think that there is a comics industry. I think there are about maybe half a dozen comics industries, all sort of existing in parallel universes with the occasional crossover. So, if you ask me where like DC and Marvel are headed, I would not be able to tell you. I really have no clue. Obviously, they're branching off into non-comics media very enthusiastically. So I don't know what that means for their core comics business. If we're talking about independent webcomics aimed at grown-up audiences, man, they're going in every direction real fast. A lot of creators are using the website Patreon, and they're able to make a living for the first time off of their work instead of just off of selling products. It's literally just the creative work itself inherently that is supporting them.
Mugs,
yeah, which is really exciting because not everybody wants to do work that turns into good t-shirts and mugs.
Nobody really wants the t-shirts and mugs necessarily.
Well, yeah, but I'm
happy to just support the creator. I don't really need the
right?
mug.
Yeah, I don't want a bunch of merch, but I have a lot of creators whose work means a lot to me, so giving them $2 a month is it's great. It's so nice to have that opportunity, and my comic family man gets supported that way. It's incredibly important to me. And so the combination of sites like Patreon and Kickstarter has really opened up avenues to self-sufficiency for creators to the point where working with a publisher is now a choice as opposed to a requirement. So you can really decide what's best for you and then pursue that path. And obviously a lot of traditional book publishers are discovering that comics sell really well if you market them to the right audiences. And the right audience is, by and large, kids. Kids like comics. Did you know this? It turns out.
Well, that's funny because, it used to be like, what comics are just for kids, and
right?
Now it's sort of the opposite almost.
Yeah, precisely. But a lot of their... Brandon Telgemeier is a great example. There's this thriving marketplace for comics for kids and middle grade, and I think those readers are going to stick around. Mm-hmm. I think they're going to be reading comics for grown-ups in several years, and we're going to see an expansion of the viability of some of the work that's really just successful on the web right now is going to end up being successful in print for publishers who are able to reach a brick-and-mortar retail audience in a way that there's that gap is currently too wide, just because not enough people have read graphic novels to feel like they can. I think that gap is going to shrink a lot in a few years, and I'm really excited about it.
Well, and it seems like if you think about like Dana's comics or Outfoxed or whatever. I mean, traditionally, I think we sort of thought of kids' comics as comics adaptations of TV shows or novels or something. And when I was growing up, there were the Gold Key comics like Bullwinkle and Bugs Bunny and all these things that I watched on TV. Where now there are all these kids comics that are starting life as a comic.
Yeah, they're totally original.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I mean, one of the great things about comics is they're fairly inexpensive to produce. I mean, they're still way more expensive than prose, and it can still be tough to convince people that 24 pages of story is worth $5, but that's still so cheap compared to a television show, or even one 90-minute movie. Like the barrier to entry is so low that there are just more creative opportunities out there. And some comics are going to end up becoming TV shows and movies or whatever, but they can also have a perfectly self-sustaining existence just in their original incarnation. Yeah. And that diversity is possible because it is so fairly inexpensive to create. The risk is so low.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and not just kids' comics either. Like Fun Home became a musical. Like, that kind of blew my mind when I found out about that.
I'll know we've arrived at a really special place when there's a graphic novel out there aimed at adults that is a huge commercial success, and that is fiction. Because I think the adult market is still very stuck on memoir because it's capital S serious. Yeah. It's serious business, or it's a personal testament by somebody who happens to be a cartoonist. So of course they made a comic book. But when we get to the point where the adult literary market feels like you can go out in public reading, a fiction story or a genre story in comic book format and not be judged for it, that'll be a big moment. I think we're probably just a few years away from that. And not something like Watchmen, which is a comment on an existing commercial genre.
But yeah, like Craig Thompson, of course, he started out with his memoir with Blankets, but then he's gone into straight. What's Habibi? Is that the name of it?
Yep.
Yeah, I mean that was not for kids, not a memoir. It was just fiction, graphic novel. So
I think a lot of people didn't know what to do with it though quite yet. I think if he had published that book in 10 years from now, a lot more people would know how to classify it.
Yeah, maybe so. Yeah, because it got read, but yeah, it's not like they're making it into a movie.
Yeah, and I'm really looking forward to something having the impact of Fun Home or Persepolis, and that's coming from a fictional perspective, and it's not the genre that I like to call I had cancer with my gay dad in Iran, where these it's very personal memoirs of suffering or struggle, and those are always kind of the first to make it through the door because they can be taken, I'm making air quotes, seriously. Like grown-ups aren't allowed to have fun, I guess. I don't know. My background is in history and literature, but I'm a cartoonist, so I have a pretty wide-ranging attitude about what appropriate reading material is. My answer is normally anything. It's supposed to be fun. Reading's supposed to be fun.
Dylan Meconis is at dylanmeconis.com. Meconis is Meconis. Tell us what you think. Write us at mail@deconstructingcomics.com, Twitter @deconcomics. Like our Facebook page or join our Facebook discussion group. Find all the links in the right sidebar at deconstructingcomics.com. We're also on YouTube, on the Comics Podcast Network at comicspodcasts.com, and on comicon.com, where our new episodes appear a few days before they show up anywhere else. Also, please give us a review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play, iHeartRadio, or wherever you find podcasts. We really need more listeners to give us reviews and help us stand out from the many comics podcasts that are out there. Our theme is from bensound.com. This Thursday on To the Bat Polls, we'll be discussing Adam West's final performance as Batman, with William Shatner as Two-Face in the new animated movie Batman vs. Two-Face. Look up To the Bat Polls wherever you find your podcasts or at tothebatpolls.libsyn.com. If you're looking for some constructive feedback on your comic, send it to us and Mulele and I will critique it on our spin-off podcast, Critiquing Comics. Send it to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. We'll read at least 30 pages of it and critique it on the show. We hope to return with a new episode on November 9th. Next week, more from Helioscope with Kat Ferris, who's working on Emily and the Strangers for Dark Horse and her own webcomic The Last Diplomat. And Terry Blass, who's made a webcomic called Briar Hollow and is the co-writer of a forthcoming graphic novel from Oni Press called Morbid Obesity, a murder mystery set at a fat camp. He talks about how to make stories non-formulaic and more emotional, and identifies a huge but neglected comics market in the U.S., Latinos. Be here for Kat and Terry next week. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.